I have the I have the honor of introducing Annette Baudisch, and this is the first time I've introduced someone, so please apologies if I get this totally wrong. But Annette is a professor at the Interdisciplinary Center on Population Dynamics. As a mathematician and demographer by training, her research advances concepts, theories, and methods to study age patterns of mortality and fertility. She's been honored with, among other things, the Otto Hahn Medal and the Trailblazer Award for Demographic Analysis. Her research has been published in Science, Nature, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, as well as a range of key disciplinary journals of demography and biology. And we are so excited for your talk today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was such a perfect introduction, Ray. So the host disabled participant screen sharing. I guess I need to share my screen.
Sorry, Annette, we just realized this, and one of the GSIs is working on this.
Yeah, I know. It's all fine.
Hi, Josh. Welcome.
Good morning, Annette. It's such a pleasure to have you join us. Thank you for speaking, and thanks for staying up late for us.
Oh, it's not so late. Let me just find how I can open my presentation. I'm too stupid to do this, but I will manage in a second. I have survived this before. So share.
Oh, perfect.
Actually do this.
Yep.
The crazy professor manages finally to get her screen up.
That looks great.
Okay, can you see everything that I'm showing here?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So let's get started. It's a great pleasure for me to be invited for this workshop, and all the young and old formal demographers in the audience. It's great. It's very rare to speak to this audience, and I hope I can live up to the expectations. So the title of my talk is Formal Demography as a Tool to Innovate Measures and Concepts of Studying Lifespan and Aging. So that's really what I've been doing in the past years. And I would like to give you a perspective of how to use formal demography as finding new ways of looking at old data in a way. So I come from a background of biodemography, and what typically demographers who study human and non-human species do is they compare lifespan and aging across populations of species that live a very different amount of time. But also when you just study humans, no judgment, you can find populations with very long and very short lifespans and very different aging patterns. And if you want to study the differences in aging across populations, it's important what type of measure you use, because you can ask yourself, does the measure that I use actually capture all the signals that are relevant for my research? Am I really capturing the signal that I'm interested in? Now, usually, if you just want to know how long individuals live, then maybe you are pretty safe with life expectancy. But let's look at the formal demography as a tool on finding new measures of, or actually old measures, but still new perspectives on old data. Let's start with traditional measures of aging. When we look at kind of a cartoonic view on the human mortality pattern, so I apologize that there is no plateau in the mortality here. So mortality for humans from maturity starts rising exponentially over adulthood until some oldest age. And to describe these patterns, typically for a biologist or epidemiologist, but also in demography, we look at the initial mortality rate, and then also at how strong mortality rises with age, so the rate of aging. And simply, and you probably have heard this over the last days several times, we can denote the initial mortality rate by A, the rate of aging by B, and then we end up with this very nice and simple exponential formula where the age-specific hazard of death at age X is simply given by A times E to the BX. And this is also known as the Gompertz law, and it's already very old. And it's a mathematical function to describe mortality where the exponent of the Gompertz is typically assumed to be larger than 0. So mortality rises with age. And this is true for humans. It's also true for all kinds of primates and many other species. For example, Tuck Finch and colleagues in 1990 in Science showed that the Gompertz mortality model fits well humans, mammals, and birds. Anne Bronikowski and her teams in 2002 and also in 2011 have shown how have used this model and measured aging by the initial mortality rate and the rate of aging with great success, and compared mortality across species. And when you look at these two, so the black one is the big Bible of longevity, senescence, and the genome by Carl Finch, really made a great effort to compile mortality parameters across species and lifespans, all we knew until 1990. And then here to the right is the Jones et al. Diversity of aging across the tree of life work that shows that across the tree of life, in fact, mortality is much more complicated than just rising with age as in humans. In fact, it's diverse, and it can not only increase, but it can also fall. And I don't want to go more into detail here. That's why I'm just keeping it from the very distance in this picture. But feel free, of course, to ask any questions. So the traditional measures of initial mortality rate and the rate of aging, A and B, in principle, they can capture this diversity, because if you look at this standardized cartoonic picture, of course, for humans, the rate of aging is larger than 0. But for some other creatures, for example, like the freshwater polyp hydra, mortality can be constant with age, simply modeled by B equal to 0. So we are left by mu x equal to A. And that would be the case also for some plants and other species. But hydra really is the organism for which we have the best data and best confirmed evidence that indeed the pattern of mortality is constant with age. And then also mortality can be falling, and that could in principle be captured by exponentially decreasing mortality. Now, I have to kind of, because we just worked on a data set on turtles, and we indeed found that exponentially decreasing mortality is really a bad fit to the data. We do find declining mortality in turtles, but we don't see it declining exponentially. But that is just a side note. Here, my point is that in principle, you can use an exponential model to capture increasing and decreasing patterns of mortality with a very simple formula. But is it enough, to measure the initial mortality rate and the rate of aging to classify aging patterns across a tree of life, to say, in principle, we have constant decreasing and increasing mortality with age? Now, yes, when we have these traditional measures, they are well justified. They are intuitive, widely applicable, flexible, and simple. But do they capture all the relevant dimension? And when you can ask, what is a relevant dimension? Then it is always helpful to motivate what is relevant by theory. And I've been working a lot on evolutionary demographic theory. So let me just do a little detour there to say what is a relevant dimension here. So this picture that I've showed you here of the theoretical diversity of patterns, which is adapted from a paper that I did together with Jim Vopel 2010, sorry, just 10 years ago. That is the result of a number of evolutionary demographic models that we have developed together since my PhD thesis. And several of them you can find in this book, which is called Inevitable Aging: Contributions to Evolutionary Demographic Theory. It's freely available online, so you can download the different chapters. And what we find is that, increasing constant and decreasing mortality can be evolutionary optimal. And this is all like formal demographic models in there. And we don't have time to go into these models here now, but when you look into more deeply into these models, you can see, well, there are many parameters, but which parameters are really important? What parameters matter, and then what does it mean, what do all these models tell us? Now, an interesting question is, what parameter determines whether or not mortality increases with age or decreases with age? And when I looked at these models back then I saw that the parameters that tip the scale between aging or not, that tip the scale between different types of aging, positive and negative senescence, these patterns, these parameters were dimensionless. And that gave me the insight that to distinguish different types of aging, in fact, we need to factor out time. We cannot just simply look at the initial rate of aging, which is a rate, so per units of time, and then the rate of aging, which is, sorry, not initial rate of aging, the initial mortality rate, and then the rate of aging, two rates which are time dependent. So if we have only time dependent measures, then we are losing a bit the important information or the undistorted information on something that might inform us why or whether or not a species should age. I hope I make sense actually. So to reveal a new and a relevant signal from the data of what determines aging patterns to find some sort of regularities, it's important to distinguish two separate dimensions. And I call these dimensions the pace of aging and the shape of aging. One dimension is the time scale of life, so whether species live long or short, and the other is this time standardized pattern of mortality over age from maturity to the last age, whether mortality goes up or down with age, and whether it increases strongly or only mildly or doesn't change at all. And a time scale, of course, can be whether you live weeks or hours or weeks or centuries. And yeah, that's what I just said. To experience mild or strong change in mortality over the life course and whether it goes up or down. This should be measured by respectively the pace of mortality and the shape of mortality. And this framework has been motivated by this theory on why we age. So whether or not it's evolutionary optimal for increasing or decreasing mortality to evolve in a mortality in an evolutionary model that maximizes the population growth rate of a population. And it turns out that under some circumstances, it's optimal for a population to have increasing mortality, and under other circumstances, decreasing mortality. So when we measure the pace of mortality as a demographer, of course, you would immediately say life expectancy. But indeed, there are many other measures to measure lifespan, like maximum lifespan or median lifespan or percentile measures. But together with my PhD student, Thomas Fritscher, we have looked at a number of possible formal demographic measures to capture lifespan or demographic timescale, if you like, and came up with a number of criteria that such a measure should fulfill. And we found indeed that the favorite measure of demographers, life expectancies, is actually the preferable measure to capture the pace of mortality. And here it's probably a repetition for you now after this workshop. Life expectancy is given as the mean age at death, weighting the age by the fraction of dying at that age. And then the shape of mortality, the preferable measure here, it turns out we find that these are measures of relative inequality in ages at death. So not just inequality like variance, but indeed relative inequality. So the Gini coefficient, the life table entropy, and the coefficient of variation. All these measures capture variation in lifespan, and they are dimensionless, which is important as a key characteristic of the shape of mortality. And I would like to dig a little bit deeper here into the life table entropy, because it's actually a great measure and is an old measure in demography, but comes here again or emerges here from a completely new framework. It's helpful to look at the E-dagger, which you probably also have heard now several times in the last days, which has been suggested by Vopel and Canudas, but also already go back several decades earlier. Just the dagger notation, I think, comes from Vopel and Canudas. Which captures the life years lost due to death. So the average lifespan lost by those individuals that die. And it's given by this equation, which integrates over the remaining life expectancy at age X and the fraction of individuals dying at that age X. So life years left at age X times fraction dying at age X, and integrating over all ages, that gives E dagger. So when you take the ratio of life years lost and when you take life years lost relative to life expectancy, let's take an example to get a feeling of this measure. In the HMD, just averaging across all countries, in 1950, people typically lost on average 15 years of life when they died. But they also could only expect 66 years of life at birth. So the ratio of life years lost to life expectancy back in the 1950s was almost a quarter. But in 60 years later, what people kind of lost at the age of death was 10 years. So people had on average 10 years left to live when they actually died. But also life expectancy rose to close to 79. So the ratio now is much smaller, it's 0.13. So this tells us that the inequality in the lifespan has reduced over time. And this is measured by entropy, which I'm telling you now exactly. A measure of relative lifespan inequality is given by this ratio, and it's intuitive because you can see that it relates these life years lost to life expectancy at birth. And it's old, it goes back to Lesser in 1950 and Demetrius and Kiefitz. And it has been a very an established measure in demography all along. And what I find helpful is to see how this, I came from just a few minutes ago, I came from this kind of shape of aging and saying that entropy measures the shape of aging. And now I'm telling you entropy is a lifespan disparity measure. So how does lifespan disparity and shape of aging relate? When we look again at this picture and look at humans, then the ratio of life years lost at death to life expectancy is typically, or is always smaller than 1, because E dagger is smaller than E naught. So an entropy value smaller than 1 indicates a mortality pattern that increases over age, assuming that mortality is not hump-shaped or some sort of other wild pattern, but monotonously changing. Then when you think of the hydra, where mortality doesn't change with age, so I would call that negligible senescence, what we can observe is that entropy equals to 1. So no matter at what age you look at this hydra, the mortality is always the same. So an old hydra is just the same as a young hydra, and you can say it's almost like it's always like a newborn individual in that sense, or a newborn adult individual. So whatever life years you lose at a certain age, it's always the life expectancy at age 0. Here in this case, 0 means maturity. So an entropy value of 1 is the boundary of senescence, which is negligible senescence, no senescence. And then the last case, entropy is larger than 1 if the average life years lost by individuals who die are larger than life expectancy at birth. So small because initially mortality is high, for example, for this tortoise, but then when you have survived to the low mortality ages, then the remaining life expectancy goes up, and therefore an entropy larger than 1 indicates a life history of a species with negative senescence. And this is very elegant because this entropy equal to 1 marks the boundary between positive and negative senescence, and simply by looking at the summary measure, you get an information about whether or not you look at an age pattern of mortality that is going up or down. And at the same time, entropy tells you whether you have a population that has a large or a small disparity in ages at death, or you can also say equality or inequality in ages at death. So as entropy approaches 0, you converge to a population where everybody dies exactly at the same point, at the same time. So that you would have you would approach a rectangular survivorship curve, just to connect some of these concepts. Okay, where was I? Yes. Now, so I started from the Gompertz mortality model, AE to the BX, and then I came to life expectancy and E-dagger and the ratio to entropy. And the nice thing that I recently, or a year ago, found is that there is a very elegant relationship between the parameters of the Gompertz model and life expectancy and life years lost. And that is that A E naught plus B E dagger equals 1. And here we have lifespan, lifespan disparity, initial mortality, and the rate of aging. And well, why does it matter? How can it be helpful? As a formal demographer, of course, I say, oh, it's beautiful. Of course it matters. But let's give a more concrete answer. Well, it relates to it relates to key demographic summary measures for a general mortality model, which holds not only for humans, but also captures the mortality of other species over adult ages pretty well. So it's a very flexible and simple mortality model applicable to compare different species. And it's at the same time analytically tractable, and that makes it so beautiful for formal demographers. So it aids formal demographic analysis, and it supports also an increasing interest in research across demography on lifespan and lifespan disparity and how these two relate. For example, this is moving. Yeah, paper by Aburto et al. In 2019 shows or demonstrates the dynamics of life expectancy and lifespan inequality across the human mortality database for 49 countries and regions. Across time, you see the violet is the older populations and the yellow ones are the younger populations, and they find a strongly linear relationship between the pace and the shape of mortality. So a linear relationship between lifespan and a relative measure of equality. So here note that the log E naught divided by E dagger is actually the log of the inverse of entropy here, because as entropy rises, equality falls. And so you take the inverse and then its equality rises. So this measure, which has been motivated by theory on why we age, reveals suddenly, in looking at the human data, as very rigid constraint on how longevity evolves over historical times in different population, and that this evolution in longevity really has to toe the line, if you like. And Aburto et al. Here, they say they develop a unifying framework to study life expectancy and lifespan equality over time, relying on concepts about the pace and shape of aging. So these measures of lifespan and lifespan equality, even though they are old, because life expectancy is an old known measure and and entropy is an old known measure, still they reveal suddenly new insights into macro level patterns of the evolution of longevity, which made me very happy, I have to admit. And this research on Aburto et al. Was actually inspired by an earlier result of Fernando Cochero and colleagues. And here you can see essentially the same measure. We look at life expectancy and the log inverse of entropy. And we have here the gray line from slave populations that had a life expectancy of barely 2 years up to Japan in 2002, different human populations, including hunter-gatherers, including historical England, including different Swedish populations. They all fall on this. And in comparison, non-human primate violet dots, they also fall on some sort of rough line, but are still in the proximity. And just as an interesting kind of side observation here maybe is we also use this to look at flowers, plants with flowers, angiosperms, and across different types of like bushes and herbs and trees, we could see this kind of bend shape. So it doesn't have to be linear like in humans, but it can also have some other relationship between these measures. Just to end this little excursus into the data. So looking at these two dimensions, the pace and the shape of aging, we can see different macro level patterns when we compare different kinds of populations across different environments and regimes. Coming back to this inequalities. Coming back to this equation, I think that this kind of simple relationship between the parameters of the Gompertz model and the lifespan and EDAGR can support comparative research across the tree of life on lifespan and lifespan variation. And it can also help to explore dynamics in what I call the pace-shaped space. So if you have a population with a certain lifespan and a certain equality, and then you use the Gompertz model to explain how this population may move in pace-shaped space if a mortality parameter changes, then what you will do is you take the derivative of this variable with respect to the mortality parameter. And here I'm using the notation by Jim Vopel, denoting relative change as this accent. So dx dA divided by x is the relative change. And it turns out that even the relative change of INAT and EDAGR, here actually INAT, follow a nice relationship. Indeed, I'm lying a little bit here because in fact it should be with a minus. So minus the relative change in life expectancy with respect to parameter A times A plus the relative change in life expectancy with respect to parameter B times B equals 1. The same is true for EDAGR. And like structurally similar equation also holds for entropy, just that the sum here is 0 and not 1. And one could interpret this that the first two constraints or the first two equations that describe relative change in life expectancy and EDAGR with respect to the Gompertz parameters, these are like weighting functions. So a change with respect to the level parameter has to balance a change in the rate parameter. And this is true both for life expectancy and disparity. While for entropy, it's more like a budget constraint. So whatever expenses, whatever costs you have on the one side, you have the benefits on the other. So they have to sum to 0. Well, future applications will have to show how useful these equations will be, but I like them for their elegance. This excursus into like the Gompertz model and how the derivatives sum up to 1 and 0, it contributes to a much larger body of research by many of the formal demographers like Wolmes and Horiochi, Edwards, Turja, Burka, and Van Raalte and Caswell and everybody. And it just shows that there is, and I'm apologizing to everybody that I am not citing here because there are many, many more. It just reflects that there is an increasing interest in lifespan inequality and its relationship with lifespan. And I'm calling it the pace and shape because it came out of my evolutionary demographic research. But of course, you don't have to call it the pace and shape. You can also call it lifespan inequality. However, in my specific framework, it's important to look at relative inequality, while of course also absolute inequality is important. Okay, just to come to the end of my talk, I just wanted to mention that this can also be extended to fertility, and I've done it at first in an evolutionary journal, ecological journal for non-human species, which is called the Pace and Shape Perspective on Fertility. But here we didn't work with birth counts. We worked with the maternity function because typically birth counts, this level of data you do not have available for many species. It's typically humans that are blessed with this many data. But then I came to think much more about this and how one could develop a similar framework for fertility that we have for mortality. And then I have been thinking what makes formal demography of mortality so strong is that we all just die once, and we all die for sure, and it's not our choice. Our choices may determine when we die, but that we die is certain. And what makes fertility research often so complicated is that there is choice involved in fertility, and whether or not a woman gives birth once or many times or not at all, this is up to a complex multitude of entangled factors. However, we are all born, and we are all born only once, and we do not decide whether or not we are born. We just experience that we are there. And using this analogy, I then came up with an idea, a very simple idea, basically an old idea of applying the life table method to this born, and I call it born once, die once approach. And that leads to a fertility table. Again, also fertility tables existed, but just not from that perspective. And it's another simple example how to take the existing formal demographic tools and twist it just a little bit to give a new perspective. And this new perspective worked so well that I actually managed to use it as a foundation for an ERC consolidator grant. And in this consolidator grant, I am proposing to develop or work towards a transdisciplinary theory of birth and death, because now, once, like with a similar language for formal demographic language of birth and death, we may actually have the foundation of modeling mortality and fertility in a very similar way. And here I am, I'm very much looking forward to using the tools of formal demography to conceptualize and model birth and death individuals, eventually across any kind of across disciplines. So for any kind of individual, already inspired being by Jim back then when I was a PhD student, the population of fruit flies or light bulbs or Toyotas. It could be a population of anything. And so please, if you want to hear more, please contact me. And to, in that way, kind of sum up and zoom out a little bit, I believe that population aging, species extinction, our sustainability crisis, our current pandemic, all these major problems of the world, they indeed, from a formal demographic perspective, they result from an imbalance of birth and death processes. Sometimes there is too much birth, sometimes there is too much death. Things get out of bounds. And I believe that formal demography and formal demographers are the key to conceptualize and model birth and death process, and of course also migration, in whatever discipline. So my conclusion is the world needs more formal demographers. So I have high hopes for you all, and I hope that I could give a little inspiration here for your future. So with that, I'm thanking you for your attention. I hope that I was understandable. My computer is falling down.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you, Annette.